It was supposed to be a normal day, quiet, uneventful, forgettable. Steven Seagal wasn't attending a movie premiere. He wasn't surrounded by fans or cameras. He wasn't even dressed like a celebrity. He wore simple clothes, a dark jacket, jeans, and sunglasses. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another middle-aged man going about his business in public. But that normal moment changed in seconds. A police officer nearby noticed Steven and began watching him closely. At first, it was subtle, a long stare, a slow walk in his direction. Then the officer stepped forward, blocking Steven's path. "Sir, I need to talk to you," the officer said, his tone sharp and authoritative. Steven stopped calmly. He removed his sunglasses and looked at the officer, not annoyed, not nervous, just attentive. "Yes, officer," he replied. The officer didn't return the courtesy. "Where are you headed? And what are you doing here?" he asked, scanning Steven from head to toe as if he were already guilty of something. People nearby slowed down. A few glanced over their shoulders. Something felt off. Steven answered politely, "I'm just passing through. Is there a problem?" That's when the officer's attitude shifted. "Don't play games with me," the officer snapped. "I asked you a question." The tension in the air thickened. Steven remained still. No sudden movements. No raised voice. What most people didn't realize was this. Steven Seagal had spent decades studying discipline, control, and real-world conflict. He had trained law enforcement. He understood authority. And he understood when power was being misused. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he stayed calm. The officer took a step closer. "Do you have identification on you?" Steven nodded slowly. "I do. But may I ask why I'm being stopped?" The officer didn't answer. He simply stared, asserting dominance through silence. At that moment, something important happened. Steven realized this wasn't about safety. It wasn't about procedure. It was about ego. Around them, people were now openly watching. A woman paused mid-step. A man subtly raised his phone. And then the officer said something that crossed a line. His voice lowered. His words sharpened. "Sir, don't make this difficult. Because I can make it very difficult for you." The crowd felt it. Steven felt it. And instead of reacting with anger, Steven Seagal did something no one expected. What happened next would completely change how this encounter ended, and leave everyone watching in absolute shock. The officer's words hung heavy in the air. "Because I can make it very difficult for you." For a brief moment, everything felt frozen. Conversations nearby faded. Footsteps slowed. Even the city noise seemed to dull as people sensed something was wrong. Steven Seagal didn't flinch. He had faced pressure before, real pressure. Not this kind of theatrical intimidation, but moments where staying calm meant staying alive. So instead of reacting emotionally, he took a slow breath and stood his ground. "I'm not trying to make anything difficult," Steven said evenly. "I'm cooperating." But the officer wasn't interested in cooperation. He stepped closer, invading Steven's personal space. "Then stop asking questions and do what you're told." That's when the mood shifted. A man nearby frowned and whispered to his friend, "Why is he talking to him like that?" A woman shook her head. "This is unnecessary." Phones began to come out, discreetly at first, then openly. People had learned something over the years. When power crosses a line, documentation matters. Steven noticed the phones. He noticed the crowd. But most importantly, he noticed the officer's posture, rigid, defensive, driven by control rather than duty. This is how situations escalate, not because of danger, but because ego refuses to step back. The officer pointed at Steven's chest. "I asked for your ID. No." Steven nodded again, slowly. "I'll show it to you. But I'd still like to understand why I'm being stopped." That question, calm, reasonable, irritated the officer even more. "You don't need to understand," he snapped. "You need to comply." At that moment, Steven made a conscious decision. He could escalate. He could argue. He could assert who he was. But he didn't. Instead, he chose something far more powerful: restraint. Steven reached into his pocket carefully, deliberately, making sure his movements were slow and visible. The officer watched his hands closely, tense, ready to react. The crowd watched too. Someone from behind spoke up. "He's cooperating. Relax." The officer shot a look over his shoulder. "Mind your business." Now the atmosphere had fully changed. This was no longer a private interaction. This was public. And everyone could feel it. When authority forgets accountability, the public becomes the witness. Steven handed over his ID. The officer examined it longer than necessary, flipping it over, scanning it again, as if searching for something, anything, to justify his behavior. Seconds passed. Steven waited silently. Finally, he asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer didn't answer right away. He handed the ID back roughly and said, "Stand right there." Confusion rippled through the crowd. "Why?" someone muttered. Steven remained still, but his eyes sharpened, not with anger, but awareness. He understood what was happening now. This wasn't about law. It was about control slipping, and the officer trying to regain it. "Let me ask you, have you ever seen a situation where authority went too far like this? Comment below and tell us which country or city you're watching from." The officer spoke into his radio briefly, keeping his voice low. The crowd leaned in. Steven stood calmly, hands relaxed at his sides. Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't threaten. It waits. People nearby exchanged looks. Some shook their heads. Others whispered, "This doesn't feel right." And that's when everyone realized something important. This encounter wasn't ending any time soon. The officer lowered his radio and looked back at Steven. "Stay where you are," he said firmly. "Don't move." Steven nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why again. He already knew. This situation had crossed into something else entirely. The crowd around them had grown noticeably larger now. What began as a casual stop had turned into a small circle of spectators, all watching with quiet intensity. Some people whispered. Others held their phones steady, recording every second. The officer paced a few steps back and forth, visibly agitated. "Why am I being detained?" Steven finally asked, his voice calm but clear. The officer stopped pacing and turned sharply. "I didn't say detained," he snapped. "I said don't move." That answer only deepened the unease in the crowd. When clarity disappears, fear takes its place. And fear is often used as a tool. Steven stood tall, his posture relaxed but grounded. Anyone trained in reading body language could see it. This was not a man preparing to resist. This was a man prepared to endure. The officer took another step closer. "You're starting to look suspicious," he said. A man in the crowd spoke up, louder this time. "Suspicious of what?" "He hasn't done anything." The officer spun around. "Sir, I told you already, stay out of it." But now, more voices joined in. "This is getting ridiculous. He showed his ID. Let the man go." The officer's jaw tightened. He clenched his fists, then reached toward his belt, not his weapon, but close enough to make people nervous. A hush fell over the group. Steven noticed it immediately. He raised one hand slowly, palm open, not toward the officer, but toward the crowd. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Everyone stay calm." That single sentence did something remarkable. The noise faded. The crowd settled. People listened. Leadership isn't given by authority. It's felt through presence. The officer stared at Steven, clearly unsettled by the shift in energy. "Don't tell them what to do," he said. "I'm in charge here." Steven met his eyes. "I'm not challenging your authority," he replied. "I'm asking for professionalism." That word, professionalism, struck a nerve. The officer stepped closer again, his voice rising. "You don't get to lecture me. You don't get to question my decisions. And you definitely don't get to tell me how to do my job." Steven didn't back away. "Then explain it," he said evenly. "Explain why this is happening." The officer hesitated. For the first time since this began, he had no immediate answer. The silence was loud. Phones zoomed in closer. Someone whispered, "He can't even explain it." The officer cleared his throat. "You fit a description," he said abruptly. Steven raised an eyebrow slightly. "What description?" The officer waved his hand dismissively. "That's not information I need to share with you." When answers become vague, accountability disappears. Steven took a slow breath. He felt the eyes of the crowd, the tension in the air, the fragile line between calm and chaos. This was the moment. He could stay silent. Or he could speak up, not aggressively, but truthfully. "Let me ask you, in this moment, do you think Steven should stay quiet and let it pass, or calmly stand his ground? Comment, stay calm, or stand firm, below. I want to know your opinion." Steven spoke again, his voice steady, controlled. "Officer," he said, "if there's a description, and I don't match it, then this should be over. If there's no cause, then keeping me here isn't right." The officer's face flushed. "Watch your tone," he warned. "My tone is respectful," Steven replied. "Your actions are what people are questioning." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The officer looked around and realized something he hadn't noticed before. This wasn't just one man anymore. This was witnesses. This was public accountability. This was a situation spiraling out of his control. He stepped back and spoke into his radio again, more urgently this time. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I need backup." Those two words sent a chill through the crowd. Backup. Steven closed his eyes for a brief second, not in fear, but in focus. When situations escalate unnecessarily, it's often because someone refuses to admit they were wrong. He opened his eyes and looked straight ahead. Whatever was coming next, another officer, another confrontation, another test of patience, he was ready. Not with force, not with fame, but with discipline. And as the sound of an approaching siren echoed faintly in the distance, everyone watching knew one thing for certain. This encounter had reached a point of no return. The sound of the approaching siren grew louder, echoing faintly between buildings. People looked at each other nervously. Some stepped back. Others leaned in closer, sensing that whatever was coming next would change everything. Steven Seagal remained exactly where he was. Calm. Still. Centered. The officer glanced toward the street, then back at Steven, as if reassessing him for the first time. Something about this man didn't fit the usual pattern. There was no panic, no defiance, no nervous energy, just control. The crowd murmured softly. "That guy's way too calm for this." "Yeah, most people would be freaking out by now." "He's not scared at all." A young man standing near the back squinted, staring at Steven's face. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to place something familiar. "Wait," he whispered to his friend. "Doesn't he look like—" Before he could finish the sentence, the officer snapped, "Sir, stay right there." Steven didn't react. He simply nodded. Sometimes recognition doesn't come from words, it comes from presence. The young man pulled out his phone, not to record this time, but to zoom in. He compared the screen to Steven's face, then back again. His eyes widened. He leaned forward and whispered again, more urgently now, "I think that's Steven Seagal." His friend frowned. "No way. Steven Seagal? Like, the actor?" "I'm serious," the young man replied. "The martial artist. The guy from all those action movies." A ripple moved through the crowd, quiet at first, then spreading. "Steven Seagal? No, it can't be. He does kind of look like him." Phones shifted angles. Whispers grew louder. The officer noticed the change immediately. "What's going on?" he barked. No one answered him directly. Steven heard the whispers. He knew what was happening. But he didn't acknowledge it. He didn't correct anyone. He didn't confirm or deny anything. He simply stood there. True confidence doesn't rush to explain itself. The siren cut off suddenly as a second patrol car pulled up nearby. Another officer stepped out, older, more composed, scanning the scene with experienced eyes. He took in the crowd, the phones, the tension. Then his gaze landed on Steven. He paused. Just for a moment. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. The first officer noticed it. "Something wrong?" he asked. The second officer didn't answer right away. He kept looking at Steven, studying him more closely now, the posture, the stillness, the unmistakable discipline. He took a step closer. "Sir," he said carefully, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Steven nodded. "Of course." The first officer stiffened. "What's this about?" The second officer glanced at him briefly. "Just assessing the situation. Experience recognizes what ego overlooks." The crowd sensed it too, the shift. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed direction. What once felt aggressive now felt uncertain. The young man from earlier whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "I'm telling you, that's him. He trains law enforcement. He's legit." A woman nearby crossed her arms. "Then why is he being treated like this?" That question hung in the air. Let me ask you, should someone be treated differently because they're famous, or should respect be the same for everyone? Comment, "Same rules," or "Fame matters" below. The first officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, people are making claims about who you are," he said to Steven. "Care to explain?" Steven met his eyes calmly. "I'm just a citizen standing here," he replied. "That shouldn't change how this is handled." The second officer raised his eyebrows slightly, impressed. The crowd murmured again. "Wow. He didn't even pull the celebrity card." That's respect. Some people don't need titles to command respect, they earn it through restraint. The second officer took a small step back and spoke quietly into his radio, his tone very different from the first officer's. "Yes," he said. "I'm on scene. Just clarifying a few things." The first officer shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since this began, he wasn't in complete control of the situation. Steven noticed it. So did everyone else. The power balance, once so clear, was now unstable. And as the crowd waited, breath held, one truth became undeniable. This encounter was no longer about suspicion. It was no longer about authority. It was about who truly understood control. And the real reveal was coming next. The air felt heavier now. Not because of anger, but because of truth. The second officer stood slightly behind Steven, watching quietly. He hadn't intervened yet, but his presence alone had changed the atmosphere. The first officer felt it. Everyone did. The crowd was no longer unsure. They were paying attention. Steven took a slow breath and turned his focus back to the first officer. "Officer," he said calmly, "I want to be very clear." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I've followed every instruction you've given. I've shown identification. I've remained calm. And yet, I'm still standing here without an explanation." The officer crossed his arms defensively. "You don't get to dictate how this goes." Steven nodded slightly. "I'm not dictating. I'm asking for fairness." That word landed differently this time. Fairness. When calm meets injustice, it forces everyone to confront the truth. The officer scoffed. "You think this is unfair?" Steven didn't answer immediately. He glanced briefly at the crowd, not for support, but to acknowledge their presence. Then he spoke. "I think when authority is used without reason, people stop trusting it," he said. "And when people stop trusting it, everyone loses." A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers. "He's right. That makes sense. Why won't the officer just explain?" The first officer's face tightened. "You're turning this into a speech," he snapped. Steven met his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "You did. The moment you threatened instead of explained." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Words spoken calmly often hit harder than words shouted in anger. The officer took a step forward, clearly trying to regain dominance. "Last chance," he said. "You either stop questioning me, or this escalates." The crowd reacted immediately. "That's not right. He hasn't done anything. You're abusing your power." The officer spun around. "Everyone back up." But no one moved. Steven raised his hand again, slow, deliberate. "Please," he said to the crowd, "let him speak." That stopped them. Even the officer paused, momentarily thrown off by the fact that Steven was controlling the situation without force, without shouting, without authority. Real power doesn't demand silence. It earns it. The officer exhaled sharply. "You think you're smarter than me?" he asked. Steven shook his head. "No. I think we're both responsible for how this ends." That answer unsettled him. The second officer stepped forward slightly. "Maybe we should clarify the reason for the stop," he said evenly. The first officer shot him a look. "I've got this." But his voice lacked confidence now. Steven saw the opening, not to attack, but to redirect. "Officer," he said, "if I've done something wrong, I'll take responsibility. But if I haven't, then this shouldn't continue." The crowd waited. So did the second officer. The first officer hesitated, just long enough for everyone to notice. Hesitation reveals doubt, and doubt weakens false authority. "Let me ask you, do you think Steven is handling this the right way? Should he continue staying calm, or should he be more direct?" Comment "calm" or "direct" below. The officer finally spoke, his tone defensive. "You're being held because you're uncooperative." A wave of disbelief swept through the crowd. "He cooperated." "That's a lie. He did everything you asked." Steven didn't react to the noise. He focused only on the officer. "With respect," he said, "asking for a reason isn't being uncooperative. It's being human." That sentence hit harder than any accusation. The second officer nodded slightly. The first officer noticed. And that's when it happened. For the first time, his authority cracked. "You don't understand how this works," he said, his voice rising. "You don't understand the pressure of this job." Steven's eyes softened. "I do," he replied. "That's why I'm asking you to slow this down before it goes somewhere it shouldn't. Wisdom isn't about winning, it's about preventing damage." The crowd fell silent again. No shouting. No chaos. Just awareness. The officer looked around and realized the truth he had been avoiding. This situation was no longer under his control. And he wasn't losing it because of defiance. He was losing it because of restraint. The second officer stepped closer now, his voice calm but firm. "I think we should take a moment," he said. The first officer didn't respond right away. He couldn't. Because every eye was on him. Every camera was rolling. And Steven Seagal, still calm, still respectful, had just exposed the difference between power and authority. And as the tension reached its breaking point, one thing became clear to everyone watching. The truth was about to come out. And once it did, nothing would be the same. The second officer took a step forward, positioning himself between Steven and the first officer, not aggressively, but deliberately. "Let's reset this," he said calmly. "Right now." That single sentence changed everything. The first officer stiffened. "I said I've got this." The second officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge him directly. He simply asked a question. "Then explain the reason for the stop," he said. "Clearly. On record." The crowd leaned in. Phones were no longer discreet. They were openly raised, steady, documenting. The first officer opened his mouth, then closed it. Seconds passed. When someone in power can't explain their actions, the truth begins to surface. Steven remained silent, hands relaxed, posture neutral. He didn't need to say anything now. The moment had shifted beyond him. The second officer glanced at Steven briefly. "Sir," he asked, "have you been informed that you're being detained or arrested?" "No," Steven replied calmly. "Have you been told what law you're suspected of violating?" "No." The second officer nodded slowly. Then he turned back to the first officer. "That's a problem." A murmur swept through the crowd. The first officer's face flushed. "I was conducting a field interview." The second officer responded evenly. "A field interview requires reasonable suspicion." "What was yours?" Silence again. This time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was revealing. Accountability feels like an attack only when authority is misused. The second officer exhaled and made a decision. "Sir," he said to Steven, "you're free to go." For a moment, no one reacted. Then the crowd erupted. "He's free. Finally. That went way too far." The first officer snapped, "You can't just—" "Yes, I can," the second officer interrupted calmly. "And I am." He turned to Steven again. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Steven nodded respectfully. "Thank you, officer." He could have walked away right then. Everyone expected him to. But he didn't. Steven paused and looked back at the first officer. Not with anger. Not with pride. With something else. Concern. "Officer," Steven said quietly, "may I say one thing?" The second officer hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." The crowd fell silent again. Steven spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I know this job is stressful," he said. "I know you deal with danger, disrespect, and pressure every day. But how you treat people, especially when they're calm and cooperative, matters more than you realize." The first officer looked away. Real strength doesn't humiliate. It reflects. Steven continued. "You didn't recognize me today," he said. "And that's fine. You shouldn't have to. But what if I wasn't me? What if I was someone with less confidence, less patience, less control?" That question hung in the air. The crowd felt it. The officer swallowed. Steven finished softly. "This could have ended very differently. No insults. No accusations. Just truth." The second officer nodded slowly, understanding exactly what Steven was doing. The first officer didn't respond. He didn't need to, because everyone had already seen it. The most powerful lesson is the one delivered without force. Steven turned and began to walk away. The crowd parted naturally, respectfully, almost instinctively. Someone called out, "Much respect." Another said, "You handled that perfectly." Steven raised a hand slightly in acknowledgement, nothing dramatic, and continued on. As he disappeared down the street, the second officer turned to the first. "We'll talk later," he said quietly. The first officer stared at the ground. The crowd slowly dispersed, conversations buzzing. "That was wild. I've never seen someone stay that calm. He taught a lesson without throwing a punch." This wasn't a victory of fame. It was a victory of discipline. Let me ask you, do you think this situation ended the right way? Should Steven have walked away sooner, or was it important that he spoke up at the end? And tell us, which country or city are you watching from? Because the truth is, the ending wasn't unexpected because Steven used his strength. It was unexpected because he didn't. No fight. No shouting. No ego. Just composure, accountability, and restraint. And sometimes, that's the most powerful ending of all. The street slowly returned to normal. Cars passed. Conversations restarted. The crowd thinned out, one by one, but something had changed. The energy left behind wasn't relief. It was reflection. Steven Seagal walked a few blocks before stopping near a quiet corner cafe. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. His breathing was steady, his posture relaxed. But his mind was active. Just because a moment ends doesn't mean its impact does. Across the street, two people who had witnessed everything replayed the scene on their phones. "I've never seen anyone handle police pressure like that," one said. "He didn't win by fighting," the other replied. "He won by not losing control." Inside the patrol car, the silence was uncomfortable. The first officer stared straight ahead, jaw tight. The second officer drove slowly, deliberately, giving space, not to punish, but to let reality settle. After a minute, the second officer spoke. "You know why that went wrong?" he asked calmly. The first officer didn't answer. "Because you stopped seeing a person," the second officer continued, "and started seeing a threat that wasn't there." The words weren't harsh. They were honest. Correction doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Back on the street, Steven ordered a coffee and stood near the window. A young barista hesitated, then finally spoke. "Sir, were you really Steven Seagal?" Steven smiled faintly. "I am. Her eyes widened. You didn't say anything back there. He nodded. I didn't need to. She thought about that for a moment. I think you taught everyone something. Steven looked out the window, thoughtful. I hope so. True lessons aren't announced. They're absorbed. Within hours, clips from the encounter began circulating online. Not because of who Steven was, but because of how he behaved. Comments flooded in. This is how you de-escalate. Calm is power. Why don't more people handle conflict like this? Even people who didn't like Steven Seagal paused. Because this wasn't about movies. It wasn't about fame. It was about composure under pressure. Let me ask you, if you were in Steven's place, could you have stayed that calm? Be honest. Comment yes or no, and tell us why. Later that evening, the second officer filed his report. It was factual, clear, unemotional, and it included something rare. A note about unnecessary escalation. The first officer read it silently. No argument. No excuses. Just reality. Growth begins the moment excuses stop. Meanwhile, Steven received a quiet phone call from an old contact in law enforcement. I saw the video, the voice said. You handled that with restraint most officers struggle to learn. Steven replied simply, everyone deserves dignity, especially in tense moments. There was a pause. We could use that message again, the voice said. Steven didn't answer right away. Then he said, then teach it. Don't just say it. Change doesn't come from moments. It comes from repetition. The next morning, a headline circulated, not sensational, not dramatic. A lesson in calm, how one encounter showed the power of restraint. No insults. No blame. Just analysis. People shared it quietly, thoughtfully, because something about it felt real. Do you think moments like this actually change behavior, or do they get forgotten too quickly? Comment change or forgotten, and tell us where you're watching from. Steven Seagal never commented publicly. No interviews. No statements. But the video kept spreading. And with it, a simple reminder echoed. The strongest response isn't dominance. It's discipline. The loudest message isn't shouted. It's demonstrated. Because in the end, the officer didn't lose his job. Steven didn't gain anything. But thousands of people learned something that day. Calm is contagious. Respect disarms. And control, real control, starts within. That's why this story didn't end on the street. It continued in conversations. In comments. In moments where someone paused instead of reacting. And that was the most unexpected outcome of all.